Can you repair relations today, sir? How will you pressure Putin today? Do you feel prepared, Mr. President? Will you find common ground? Go. Out. Come on, get up.
All right, so there you have it. Reporters shouting questions, but we did see a handshake, a pretty significant handshake, Clarissa, from these two leaders, the Russian president, the U.S. president, the opening statement from the Swiss president, translated into Russian and then English.
Yes, welcome to the city of peace, he said, and wishing fruitful conversations, not just for your countries, but for the entire world. And I think that's part of what's important to remember here when we're looking at the summit, when we're looking at the historical significance potentially. This isn't just about the U.S. and Russia sitting down for a conversation. This is about democracies challenged by authoritarian regimes. Many countries across the world will be looking to see what happens today, whether anything can be taken out of it and turned into something more productive.
You know, these moments are about moments. And I'll tell you one moment I noticed there in the Biden-Putin interaction. The handshake, Biden looked Putin in the eye with a smile. Putin looked away. Again, you don't want to read too much or too little, but again, these are about public posturing. It's about how you project strength. And that was a notable moment to me as you watched them shake hands.
Who goes first? Who extends their hand first?
Exactly.
And there was that moment
Biden
of
did
hesitation.
extend. He did extend.
We were waiting to see if there would be that handshake.
And there was.
And there was that handshake, and it was a significant handshake. It's a good way to start this meeting, and let's see what happens over the next 4 or 5 or 6 hours.
And as the president of the Swiss Federation said, Guy Parmelin, to promote dialogue and mutual understanding, that's the intention. Then he said goodbye, because his job is done. He's done the ceremony, and now the hard work is happening behind those
closed doors. And the doors closed, very symbolically. And now we are all left to wonder what will go on in those rooms over the course of the next 4 or 5 hours, and what role they may have in reshaping or at least improving somewhat the relationship.
And they both did give a wave to the journalists who were outside, and the journalists, that's their job to ask questions. So there were shouted questions. We're not surprised they weren't answered.
Exactly. You know, one thing that will not happen in this summit that happened when former President Trump met Putin is tearing up the notes after the meeting, right? You know, you had moments like that were extremely unusual under the prior president. Here, much more pro forma. You will have the note takers in the room. You will have other diplomats involved, at least in the expanded sessions, not the one-on-one sessions. But that's something that is not insignificant either. A return to a more traditional way of the U.S. conducting diplomacy.
Evan Osnos is joining us right now, our CNN contributor, staff writer for The New Yorker. He's also the author of the important book, Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. Evan, thanks so much for joining us. So give us your thoughts as the President of the United States goes into this new meeting with the President of Russia.
One of the things that anybody in Joe Biden's office learns when they get there is that he believes that diplomacy, foreign affairs, is an extension of domestic affairs, domestic politics. You know, he grills his advisors, sometimes to the point of exhaustion, over what it is that's on the mind of that foreign leader that they're sitting down with. What are their priorities? What are their fears? What are the pressures bearing down on them in their own domestic politics? You know, he is sometimes irritated diplomats over the years. As he said to me in the past, he said, look, I look at what they tell me to say, and I say, this doesn't make any sense. I need to convey to the person across the table that I understand deeply what their problems are. In this case, Vladimir Putin, of course, has reasons for both, I would say, some feelings of strength and vulnerability. Obviously, his economy is in terrible shape. There's a spike in COVID infections. And yet, at the same time, you've got high oil prices, and you see him cracking down on dissent. So he's dealing with a counterparty here today who can go either way, in the sense that he can either be acting out of a sense of feeling empowered or can be looking for those moments that might shore him up on the foreign stage. But what I think you just saw in that moment, that sort of key first public encounter in their new roles as President Biden, they've of course met before, but what you saw there was an effort to say, let's start this at least in a spirit of what Joe Biden, of course, would describe as the possibility of getting something done. And that really reflects how he operates in Washington and also how he operates on the world stage.
And he does believe, and I've covered him and you've covered him for a long time, he does believe in a dialogue even with adversaries. And maybe nothing will come of it, maybe something will come of it, but he wants to have a serious conversation right now with the Russian leader, right?
He does. Look, he regards this as the beginning of a process. This is by no means the end of it. In fact, he thinks this is really about what we can say is setting the terms of engagement. Obviously, letting it be known that there is a new American president here who is not going to participate in some of the public spectacle that Vladimir Putin was able to enlist Donald Trump into over the last 4 years. He is making it clear. Look at the people in the room who he's with in this meeting. These are all serious practitioners with a lot of experience in Europe. Toria Nuland, of course. Also, you've got Tony Blinken, who has been as close to Joe Biden as ever. One person I'd like to mention who's not in the room but is playing an important role in the background here is the CIA director, Bill Burns, who is in the U.S. government today, the person who has spent more time looking at Vladimir Putin up close than anybody else. He's been a key part of the preparation for this process. And Bill Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008, is one of the people who has helped shape the American understanding of how Putin thinks. Bill Burns once wrote that understanding the Kremlin is as much about psychology as it is about geopolitics. And I think that's the sort of combination of powers that he's going into the room with, trying to think not only what's happening out in the world, but also what's happening between Vladimir Putin's ears. That's as much a part of this process.
Yeah, we're told he spent a lot of time in recent days, President Biden, reviewing, going through background briefings, speaking with all the top Russia experts in the U.S. government, and indeed some from outside the U.S. government, giving him a better sense of what possibly to anticipate during this summit with Putin, right?
Yeah. Well, the other people he's been talking to, of course, over the last week are some of the foreign leaders that he encountered at the G7 at the NATO meeting. Angela Merkel, German chancellor, has as close a relationship, or at least as clear an understanding of Vladimir Putin as anybody in European leadership today. We know that they spoke about how he should think about this meeting. He's also, he has been going back, as we've talked about, his experience in the Soviet Union first and in Russia is substantial and specific. If you go back to 1979 when he made a trip to the Soviet Union, one of the patterns that we begin to see is that Biden is very comfortable telling people clearly if he thinks they're not telling him the truth. In that meeting, he sort of famously used a four-letter word to challenge his Russian interlocutor. Another senator in that delegation said to ask the translator, how did you translate that? The translator said, not literally. So I think you can expect that Biden is prepared, as much as Vladimir Putin has a reputation for putting people a little bit off balance. Biden believes there can be some value in that, particularly if it clears away the diplomatic mist, lets the other person know that you're onto them, that you're thinking clearly about what they're doing out in the world. So I think you can assume that he has gone into this fully loaded. He knows both the short-term and the long-term issues, and he's really, I think this is the key point to take away today, Wolf, is this is about him trying to understand what is going on in Vladimir Putin's mind. Is this about Russia genuinely trying to arrest this downward spiral in U.S. relations? Or is this just about Putin trying to achieve some measure of visibility on the public stage? That's the key determination for them. If they see an opportunity to try to actually build something, as they say, more stable and predictable, that's the watchword of the week, I think you can expect to see that indicated in what comes out of the meeting, maybe the beginning of a dialogue about strategic stability. That's going to be a sign that they were able to sense from Putin that he wants to do something different, but they don't know going into it.
And you make an important point. President Biden goes into this meeting with President Putin with the strong backing of the G7 and NATO allies. That's why he met with them in the days leading up to this summit. Evan Osnos, we'll stay in very close touch with you. Thank you